Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really, it's such an honor to be here with these esteemed panelists. And just a couple of logistics, if I could ask you to silence your phones, but also there will be a QR code. So if you have questions as we're going through this session this morning, please leverage the QR code, write your questions in there, and as time allows, we will get to a couple of those questions at the end, all right? So today, it's my pleasure to welcome to stage, we have Danielle Hale, Chief Economist for Realtor.com. We have Mayor Kirk Watson, your local mayor for Austin. Yes.
Most popular.
And we have Mary Kay Cunningham from the Urban Institute. And then myself, I am Kendall Bonner. I'm the VP of Industry Relations and Strategic Partnerships for EXP. Now, today we're here to talk about the untapped and unlocking the inventory, right? According to Realtor.com, you recently released a report today that signaled that we have nearly 4 million homes missing from today's inventory. Now, this is super impactful, right? Because we are not only dealing with a housing shortage, but we're also dealing with affordability crisis, right, as well. And that's impacting both rental and purchase inventory, right, for real estate. So with that being said, I want to start with you, Danielle. Talk to us about the numbers, talk to us about the report. Let's dive into that as we set the stage for our audience today.
Yeah, thanks, Kendall. So as you were saying, we released a report today looking at the housing shortage. This is not a new problem, but it is one that I think it's important that we update and have a really current take on how big the problem is. And so our research suggests that we are 3.8 million homes short in this country. And that means over roughly the last decade, we've seen more households formed than homes that have been built. And we're looking at both the multifamily and the single family housing supply. So we're kind of agnostic about whether this is rental supply or supply of homes for people to purchase. And that 3.8 million number is comprised of not just the homes that haven't been built relative to the households that have formed. That's 2.2 million of that 3.8. We're also looking at how the lack of affordability that you mentioned, from high home prices, high rental prices, the shortage of homes on the market for sale, means that people decide not to strike out on their own. So they continue to live with their parents, or they take on roommates instead of going out on their own. And so there are these households that haven't formed. We took a look at historical headship rates, and that's comparing the population to the number of households based on historical ratios, and found that 1.6 million of that gap is attributed to households that haven't formed, and housing affordability is likely a very strong factor in that decision. So all told, 3.8 million homes short. We build a little over 1 million homes each year, so 1.3 million in the last year. So we've got a big gap to close. Now, the good news is we did see that gap narrow a little bit. So 3.8 million is not the biggest gap that we've ever seen. So we're making some progress. Builders are really trying to build. But the challenge is the progress is so small that if we kept at that pace, it would take 7.5 years to close the existing gap. And we saw a really strong year last year for construction. There are some reasons to believe, homebuilder confidence has slipped recently, that we might not see that pace continue. But I think there are opportunities, and we're going to get into that, I think, later today, to address that gap. And there are things that we can do and that we as individuals can advocate for to help builders make some more progress. So I'm hopeful, but the challenge is pretty big.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited about this panel because we are going to talk about not only how we got here, but what are some of the opportunities going forward. So Mayor Watson, talk to us a little bit about your feelings and your thoughts around the picture here in Austin, right? And how has Austin been managing the housing deficit? How's that affected?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody being here and be part of this. But the shortage, there's been a shortage in Austin. And so over a period of time, we've seen not only a shortage of housing and housing starts, but we've also seen exactly what was just referenced, which is we've seen an increase in the cost of housing and the cost of housing, not just for those that want to buy, but also with regard to renters. So we have mimicked what we're hearing in terms of this new report. That has been something that has required the city to look at how we want to address that. Really I'd say over the last decade, the city has played with how to go about addressing that. But for about 8 years of that 10 years was pretty stagnant in how to make the fix. And a lot of that was that the way the laws are set up, but also I think some of it was the approach. But in the past 2 years, we have seen enormous success in addressing this issue. We've seen this council take pretty dramatic action, and I'll mention 3 or 4 things. One is, to some degree, the city started getting out of its own way. And what I mean by that is it was too hard to get a permit. It was too hard to build the housing. When you talk about builders' confidence, that the city can have a direct impact on that because they know how hard it is. We can talk more about this at the right time, but we have seen a dramatic change in that. Where, for example, with site plans, 2 years ago, you could have expected that the initial review would take about 100 days, and now it's taking about 33. So you can see how we've made changes there. The second is we passed what we call Home One, and that was the first part of this was that we made it 3 by right on single family, so that you can put more units on a single family lot. And again, that's something we can talk more in detail about, but you can see that creates the opportunity for more supply almost immediately. Home 2 was a big change in the size of your minimum lot size. Austin, Texas had passed in 1947 a minimum lot size of 5,750 square feet. And now it's 1,800 square feet. So it only took almost 100 years, but we got there. But the truth of the matter is, once we said we were going to do that, we actually moved it very fast. And what's interesting about Austin's history is the original minimum lot size was passed in 1930 and was only 3,000 square feet. So it went up in 1947, and a part of that was segregationist policies, trying to make it harder for some people to live in different parts of the city. And then the final thing I'll mention that we've taken significant action on is on transit-oriented development. We're building a rail system. And we want to make sure that as we talk about affordability, it's not just supply, it's also paying attention to things like transportation. And in my view, you can't have real affordability without having good transportation options. So as part of the corridor of that rail line, we have passed zoning changes related to transit-oriented development that will bring about those kinds of changes. So the bottom line to it is while we understand and have suffered from some of the same issues with regard to a lack of supply and making it harder for people to build, we have taken significant action in the past 2 years in order to fix that.
Well, and I really value and appreciate a more proactive approach, right? Which it sounds like you're thinking ahead and not just reacting to what's been happening, which I think is so important in leadership in our communities. Mary, can you talk to us about your findings? You also, as the SVP of research for your company, talk to us about what you found in terms of the research on supply and land use zoning, including those drivers.
Sure. So I work for the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization in Washington, D.C. We have over 80 researchers at Urban who are dedicated to understanding some of our housing challenges across the country. The housing supply problem is just a quick answer, it is because we make it too hard to build. They're across the country and communities, it is too hard to build, it takes too long, it costs too much, it is hard to build different types of housing, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And so some of the barriers that are all interconnected, I'm going to give you 5, and Mayor Watson, you mentioned some of them already. The first is land use and zoning, which tends to favor single-family development, makes it harder to build multifamily housing. and can add a lot of time to the process. Also opens up the community to NIMBY and community opposition when you go through that process. People are really resistant, I'm sure, as you know, locally to changing
I was
land use.
6'5" when we started.
That's right. That's a good joke. So, that's the first. The second is really stringent building codes can sometimes make it tough. You really have to have a Goldilocks approach to your building codes, just right, making sure that you're protecting your residents and your communities, but also ensuring that you are not weighing down the process. The third is that there are rising costs, so land is expensive, materials, lumber, steel, all really expensive. And there's labor shortages. So we know across the country it is really difficult to actually start construction when you have a labor shortage. We rely on immigrant labor across the country, and we need to make sure that we have immigrant policies that are supportive of communities so that they can, get to work and be a part of the construction and be a part of the solution. And then lastly, we have a lack of financing mechanisms. So there really aren't a lot of diverse financing mechanisms that allow for things like building manufactured housing, building accessory dwelling units, and preservation. Preservation is such a huge part of the issue. We can build, but we also have to preserve, especially if you're interested in affordable housing. That's where we get a lot of housing that becomes affordable to people, which is build new housing, old housing filters down over time, and hopefully, and part of that is a preservation strategy.
Thank you so much, Mary. Mayor Watson, with regards to Austin and, addressing some of these land use and zoning supply or zoning issues and increasing housing supply, right? I would like to transition to that. Can you talk to us about how Austin got to the point in 2022 where the city council adopted some significant changes, right, to the land development code to foster more supply specifically?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I really like the list that she put out. There are other things that I didn't mention but we did away with certain parking requirements for multifamily. We're currently looking at single staircase instead of dual staircase, things of that nature that in the building codes that make a real difference. The way I think we got there primarily is that and I'll come at it from my personal running for office and being out there and talking to people. But one of the things that is true is Austin's a special place, and of course you'd expect the mayor to say that, but it really is. Otherwise, y'all wouldn't be here, right? But it's a special place. But we struggle with the challenge of our success, right? The greatest challenges in Austin right now are a result of success. People want to be here. People want to move here. They want to stay here. And Austin has a pretty cool vibe to it. I tell people all the time that the #1 bumper sticker and the #1 T-shirt for decades in Austin has not been what it ought to be. Kirk Watson for Austin mayor. What it's been keep Austin weird. And what that means to me is Austin is a place that is open. It's open to new ideas, change, things that'll be coming along. Because, let's face it, lots of times we hear an idea for the first time, we say, ooh, that's weird. And it really becomes something. So how do you keep Austin, Austin? How do you keep Austin, Austin? And my theory on that has been you keep Austin, Austin by you focus on that fountain of youth that we call that little public university, the University of Texas at Austin, and our private universities, Houston, Tillotson, Concordia, St. Ed's, and ACC. Because every year we have new people coming, thousands of new people coming in with new ideas, new thinking, new music, new culture, greater diversity. And then what happens is what's happened for decades. They say, I never want to leave. And they stay. And that change is what has kept Austin being Austin. We were facing a problem of creating intergenerational unfairness. I got mine, now you get yours. figure it out on your own. But for decades, we were able to have people be able to say, I never want to leave, and stay here and make those kinds of changes that have made Austin a focal point in a worldwide economy. But if we don't have the housing supply, they will go elsewhere, or they won't come here in the first place because they know they're not going to be able to stay. They'll go someplace else. So your question is, what spawned that? What was able to create the impetus for it? Well, I think the impetus for it was that we want generational equity. We want generational fairness. And we want to be a complete city. We want everyone and anyone to be able to stay here and bring their unique flavor to this town. And you can't do it if you don't have the housing.
And those are really important points too, because it is also about what drives people into the various communities and then keeps them there, impacting, head of household and things of that nature. Back to the, at a national scale, talk to us, Mary, about who is responsible for how we unlock the change, right? How do we move the levers? Also, you mentioned NIMBYism and not in my backyard, right? Talk to us about how that's impacting things and what people can do in terms of the federal government and things of that nature to help.
I mean, I think the short answer to that question is that we're all responsible, right? So, first starting with the federal government. The federal government has a significant role to play in housing supply because it holds the power of the purse. So there is no entity except for the federal government that can really fund in the way that we need to have and address this national housing crisis. And so the federal government is a major player. That's Congress, that's HUD, that's the Federal Housing Finance Agency. States and localities, of course, are major players. You all hold the local zoning and land use levers, and so making sure that we're doing things like what Austin is doing, which is really making sure that you are creating an environment that's policy friendly for development. And we see, a dozen communities across the country that are really starting to, like Austin, reform locally and make sure that, like I said, there's a policy environment that's friendly to developing. States have a role. If those localities are resistant, then states can certainly wield the carrot and the stick. So they can try to override housing bans. States can also provide incentives through federal and state funding to really increase growth. And then we need public-private partnerships with developers and the private sector. And lastly, we need people in communities to support affordable housing and housing development. And, you talked about NIMBY, and that, can be tough because people don't like change. They don't want to see change in their neighborhoods. Part of that is really working with the community, thinking about planning. So I've talked a lot about land use and zoning reform, but that's just the start. And so after you really reform your land use and zoning codes, then you really need to think about what does planning look like? What does neighborhood planning look like? So that people are getting the type of housing that they want and that they want to see in their neighborhoods, and that they are supportive of. And part of that is also infrastructure, because people, when they think about new housing coming to their communities, they think, my school's too crowded, there's traffic. Those are all reasonable complaints, right? And so really addressing those at the same time that we're thinking about housing development is really important.
Right, because wouldn't you say too, especially when it comes to infrastructure, it requires more schools, right? And
our water systems, our roads, firsthand, Mayor Watson.
Well, I was just going to say drainage, things of that nature. And one of the things that we did as part of all this is we added to the requirements on the city that we look at this. We have an ongoing performance review. We have an ongoing performance review so that we're asking the question, is what we've done going to create unintended consequences? and frankly, is it getting the consequences we intended, and or have we done something we need to tweak and change that? Because it really, I frankly, I mean, I'm not critical, but I try not to use NIMBY and YIMBY and that kind of thing, and the reason I don't is because I worry that once we put the label, we lose the empathy about why somebody might actually and truly and legitimately be concerned about the changes we're trying to bring. And I think that's important because there are real concerns, as she's pointed out. So I think you have to build into the processes an ongoing review. You don't pass it and then say, we just won, we're done.
So has Austin experienced pushback in neighborhoods? And how has that played out in the Texas legislature? Like, talk to us about that.
Well, we have experienced that, and this has been a very difficult process, I would say, and one where it requires a lot of listening, but a lot of unhappiness because of the change that comes with that. What we're seeing in the legislature, typically the people, when they think of Austin and they think of the Texas legislature, they think of us as in conflict with the Texas legislature. But when it comes to housing, Austin is, in my view, and if I do say so myself, on the vanguard of what's going on in the country with regard to getting more housing. And we're actually working in partnership with a lot of folks at the Capitol. It's not a conflict, it's a partnership. Now, they may be coming at it from shooting at the same target for different reasons, but I've never worried about, if we're all looking at the same target, why you might be doing that. But we're looking at things. In fact, I've met very recently, had dinner just the other night with some folks to talk about how we make it easier to put housing in commercial areas, but also how we do that in a practical way so that we don't have people living very near industrial and heavy industrial sites that create a problem, but things of that nature. We've talked about what we do in terms of building code, things of that nature. So right now, it'll be interesting to see how things play out. By the way, one of the other big things is third-party permitting and how we go about doing that. But how do we keep the city in the loop so that from a practical standpoint, we're doing planning and not just, saying go do whatever you want to do without having the city involved. So it's actually been kind of a welcome partnership on this.
Thank you for sharing all of that. This is great. I want to now shift gears to the current and future policy of the administration that we have in office right now. And this has been an issue of, rumblings from DC. And, what are some of the implications of the potential cuts that are being discussed? And I'll start with you, Danielle. What does that mean for the continuation of this challenge?
Well, I can talk about the fact that both presidential campaigns leading into the most recent election recognize that housing affordability is at a crisis level. And so talking about
first time in my life, we had a presidential election. Sorry to interrupt, but that was so exciting. For the first time ever, candidates talking about housing. Big deal.
Exciting, but also not exciting, because that's just a manifestation of how big the challenge is, right? So everyone has recognized that housing affordability is a problem. And, the current administration, the Trump administration, has some ideas about how to go about addressing this. Some are good ideas. They've talked about opening up federal land to building. Land is one of the things that builders need more of in order to supply the housing that's needed. Some of the administration's policies, however, are more of a mixed bag for housing. You talked about immigration being an important part. We know that roughly a third of the construction labor force was not born in the United States. So having sensible immigration policy is really important, particularly to the construction sector. We also know that a lot of materials are imported. Lumber comes from Canada, drywall comes from Mexico, and so tariff policy is very important to builders. It's one of the reasons. It's not just local policy, though you can make builders happy by speeding up the permit process. Time is money, after all, for them especially, but also the cost of materials. And right now, there are a lot of uncertainties about what's ahead, and I think when you have an uncertain future, people tend to retrench, and that's not what we want to see right now. And you can see this in some of the construction data that's been out. Permits have been relatively flat, which is good. I think that says like builders are cautiously optimistic about what's ahead, but starts have fallen. And so I think in an environment of uncertainty, builders tend to pull back. And as we said, as the report addresses, that's not what we need to see right now.
Mary?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it was so exciting to see the presidential candidates talk for the first time in my lifetime, I'm pretty old, about housing, affordable housing. And we'll see. I mean, the Trump administration so far has issued a lot of executive orders. One executive order focuses on decreasing costs and, has directed the agencies to reduce unnecessary barriers to housing supply, including regulations. But we also see that the agencies are, really under fire right now. The government, federal workers are being cut. At HUD, there is a proposal to cut staff by 50%. That is going to have a significant impact on our housing. HUD plays a critical role in administering affordable housing programs across the country. With less staff, that will certainly impact the ability to respond to affordable housing, to homelessness. The Federal Housing Finance Agency is proposed to have 40% staff cuts. That is going to affect how people get mortgages, how can we process loans. So those are, that's, I would say, real concern. I think there's two big things that I would love to see from the federal government. One is a comprehensive national housing strategy that really lays out what is the plan for addressing this big gap that Danielle highlighted. The second is that I would just really like to see more from Congress, because it's going to take some investment. We need dollars flowing into communities to be able to build not only housing, but infrastructure, which we do see, and we need to align those. So we need to be aligning housing money with transit, with infrastructure dollars, so that we can really make a big difference in communities and the housing supply problem.
Yeah, one would hope that this would be a unifying topic across party lines, right? Because it impacts all of America. Mayor Watson, for you, from a local perspective, how have the proposed HUD cuts impacted at a local level?
Well, in part, yeah, sure. In part, what they do is they put everybody where you're just kind of standing still. I mean, is what was suggested, because to some degree, we still don't know what's going to happen. And of course, everybody likes to speculate about what's going to happen, but we don't know. I think I think there are three things that worry me the most. One is, I'll start where you ended with transportation and transit. If you have a federal government that is anti-transit, that means they are to some degree going to be anti-affordability. Because we need that transit and we need them to participate in that. The other is when you hollow out these agencies that are already understaffed. Let me just tell you, my experience is they're already understaffed, and we're working very hard to help us get more housing stock. But if they're already understaffed and then you hollow them out even more, you have done damage to any sort of national policy when it comes to housing. And then the third is, as was suggested, I think early, I don't remember exactly who said it, but it was suggested earlier, the money that the federal government can put into play has to be there. And I agree that it has to be Congress and the executive branch making sure that that's there. And when you talk to, as I have, any number of people up there about this, one of the first things they'll always do, which is what a lot of people do, is they'll push it back on the local community and they'll say, well, permitting and zoning. If you'll fix that, then well, I'm with you all the way. Well, they don't always come with you all the way on that. If you're doing the permitting and you're fixing that, you're making the system work better, and you're doing the zoning that needs to happen, we need the funding. In the prior Trump administration, they worked pretty hard to do away with CDBG money and things of that nature, and I worry about that happening again this time, because it's going to be we can still build more supply than we were going to build, But to get to what I call capital A affordable housing or deeply affordable, we're still going to need that money to be able to do those things. And one of the things that concerns me is you can't put that all on the local communities. We can only have so many bond elections to do those kinds of things when we have other needs in our community. And that, by the way, is particularly true if what you also do is you do away with the tax exemption on municipal bonds. You're then going to tax us locally through that. So there's a lot to be worried about right now. I keep trying to wear my optimistic hat and think it will work itself out, but there's reason to be concerned.
Absolutely. And, one of the major topics of concern that we've addressed earlier that I'd like to come back to a little bit more deeply is affordability and the challenges associated with affordability itself. Mary, can you mention the 5 drivers around that? Can we go a little bit deeper on that, especially as it relates to the cost of building and its own impact on affordability as well?
Yeah, I think that, if housing costs are high and it costs a lot to build, it costs a lot to go through the permitting process, the land materials are all really expensive, then it doesn't pencil out for developers. And then that slows down the private market response to building. And sometimes that means that you need to, take some of those barriers down, and that's can be enough to get some of the development going. But I also think, the mayor just mentioned real deeply affordable housing. We also just need more investments in CDBG and LIHTC and other programs that provide investment to communities and really help facilitate affordable housing. Because for private developers, it just doesn't pencil out and they are not going to build it if they can't make it work. And so offering those incentives is the way to increase affordable housing.
And I noticed there's a particular builder I'm aware of that's growing across the country that is doing, they're calling it BTR, build to rent, as opposed to build to purchase. Do you see that blossoming and being a part of one of the opportunities that are available going forward, that maybe we should see more builders go that route? Is that something that would...
I think it depends. I think it depends on the community, right? All housing markets are local. I think some housing markets could benefit from that type of strategy and some might not. Some it is, institutional investors are going in, buying up properties and converting them to rentals, and that takes that can allow for more rental units, but it also can take home ownership opportunities off. So it really depends on what the housing market looks like, and I would say you can't answer that question from a national level. I would really look at it locally.
Thank you for that. And Mayor Watson, locally, can you tell us what are some of the challenges you're seeing here in Austin as it relates to affordability and the supply there?
Well, I'll go back to where I started. One of the things was we realized, and it was pointed out to us, that in our permitting process, that we were adding a huge expense to everything that was being built. Whether it was single family or multifamily, we were adding a big expense to it. And that was because we were slowing the process down. We were in our own way. And by speeding up that process and changing that, it's like an incentive, right? It's like giving them the ability to do something that will be more affordable. Because I don't as bad as the system was, I'm not sure how you ever built anything affordable when you were adding that sort of carrying cost to it. The second thing about that is what we were talking about is the price of land. And the price of land, let's face it, most of the time, the dirt is the most expensive part of that. So changing things like minimum lot sizes makes a big difference. Now you have a piece of property where you can build something smaller and it's more affordable. But then in terms of deeply affordable or capital A affordable, big A affordability, you're going to have to do some things like utilize land, right? Utilize city land. One of the things that the city of Austin did that I'm really proud of, and we're moving forward on it, is when Tokyo Electron decided it was going to move its headquarters here in Austin, we bought the land. the city of Austin bought the land, and it's right on the rail line, so that adds that transportation aspect to it. And we think we can get 1,100 units on that property. So we're going to get a developer that will come in and build on that property and put 1,100 units, and a big chunk of those will be deeply affordable as well. And then the final thing I'll say is we've got to stop the fight over transit and doing this all or nothing thing on transit, because the national numbers, and you may know these national numbers better than I do, but we think that the national numbers say that the cost of a vehicle is about $12,000 a year to a household. Well, if I can create a situation where you don't need $12,000 a year going to a vehicle, that helps you afford more. And so part of what we want to do with our transit is upgrade that in such a way, develop around it in such a way that you can have more deeply affordable as well.
Not to mention you talked about land, and that it's less land to put the cars, so that helps as well.
Very good point.
Well, in going deeper on affordability, a lot of people blame high interest rates around, making it less affordable, but also we're dealing with increased property insurance cost. Any insights there on property insurance and what we can do about that, or what level of priority we should take? Because right now, across the country, we've seen just, between hurricanes, fires, floods, storms, this rising insurance. Would any of you?
Well, all I'll say, react to that is this way. Texas doesn't have the highest homeowner insurance rate, but it has, I think I'm right when I say it has the highest growth rate in the insurance rates. And that is because of catastrophic events. Austin, Texas is also, depending upon who you listen to, we're either the 5th or the 6th most at risk in terms of wildfires. And while I think LA has changed everything with regard to how we look at wildfires, Austin and Central Texas sort of had our LA event in 2011 when we had a major fire here in Central Texas, major wildfire. And so what we're doing is looking at how you go about, we've done a lot of things, by the way, with regard to our fire department and training people with regard to how they address wildfires. But when it comes down to it, insurance is then going to play a role in how, in the cost of housing and how people react to that. And so we're in the process of looking at our wildfire urban interface and how we go about it, but we're trying to do it where we don't create the unintended consequence of creating a problem with regard to insurance. That is one of the ways, by the way, that the state government, I think, could be helpful to us. It could be, because I can't regulate the insurance industry. I can't put certain requirements on them. At the state government level, my hope would be that they would look at this. If they're interested in helping us with the cost of housing, which they've indicated they are, then help us with that issue as well.
Speaking of unintended consequences that you mentioned earlier, and we were talking about zoning laws earlier as well, and how we needed to loosen them. What are potential ramifications or side effects of doing that? And I'll start with you, Mary, when I finish the question. And what about the fact that, for example, at one point I think I had heard that people were looking at turning commercial buildings into residential properties that would take a significant loosening of zoning laws. Can you share with us what some of your concerns, thoughts, or opinions are about that?
Sure, there's a couple questions in there. So I won't start with, we live in the age of extreme weather events. And so one possible adverse effect of loosening zoning or building code is thinking about impacts from climate. And so we have to factor that in. And I mentioned the sort of Goldilocks approach earlier. We have to be thinking about how do we build climate resilient housing. And part of that is building, part of that is land use. And making sure that there are financing mechanisms available to build new approaches, technological in different housing formats. So that's one, I think that sort of unpacks your first question. The second is, I think at the end of the pandemic, when we were all coming out of the pandemic, we had a lot of vacant buildings in cities across the country, still do. Many places still have large office buildings that are vacant, and I was really optimistic about, hey, let's turn that into housing, as a person who thinks about this all day and how can we have more housing. I mean, I think the jury is still out on that because it's pretty complicated. Part of that is the floor plans, the lighting, the elevators, the sewage system, the bathrooms, commercial buildings are just not set up for residential, and converting them can be pretty expensive. So I think that there are some places, older buildings may be more ready for a retrofit. So I would say, yes, we should be exploring every option for affordable housing, but I would not put all my eggs in that basket. And so, just thinking about other options, the mayor mentioned, public lands. I think we should be thinking about faith-based lands owned by medical, universities. All of that can be a part of your housing strategy.
Absolutely. And Mayor Watson, with what's been done in Austin, boots on the ground, is it working?
Well, she answered the question really well about the difficulty of converting. But that doesn't mean you can't make zoning changes that allow things to go into places. Okay, the commercial, so there's no residential. Well, I think you want to be able to make it more flexible so that you can have residential in those commercial areas. There are a couple of things, though, that I think you have to take into account when you do that. One is what I was saying earlier. I worry greatly about situations where what you do is you say pretty much anything can go in there, or anything can go in anywhere when it's commercial. Because what will happen is we will create housing opportunities that ultimately the poorest of the poor will be the ones that take advantage of that, and we will be putting people right up next to industrial sites that really, that is not, it's one thing to want more housing. It's another thing to want the housing in such a way that ultimately will do damage to families that want to be there. That's one of the things. The second thing is that I can see where on some commercial, you have a very nice commercial building and they want to add 5 stories of condos, but they're nice condos and everybody's ready to do it. But it's not affordable in the sense of, are we getting more deeply affordable, things of that nature. So what I would hope that we would be able to do as part of our zoning and working with commercial areas being converted to include residential is that we would do it in such a way where local communities can give bonuses, like density bonuses, that would also help. We'll give you even more, but you're going to have a certain percentage of those be affordable within a certain, MFI, things of that nature. So we're seeing that will work. We're also, that's one of the things I'm working at the legislature, where you're seeing that they want to make it easier to do, or mandated in some cases. But we're ready to try those kinds of things. We just want to be able to make sure that we do it in a way that doesn't create a practical problem, and we do it in a way that actually helps us focus on increasing the deeply affordable as well.
Very good. If it's possible, can we get the QR code up for the question to open that up? I do have one more question for you all to answer, but I wanted to give them an opportunity to submit their questions right now, because in the interest of time, I'd like to be able to have you all answer at least one or two of them. But my final question is around, again, talking about supply. And the question is not only, are we able to build, but where we're building, and does where we build matter? And so I'd like to start with you, Mayor Watson, on this particular question. With economic opportunity in Austin, is where we build in Austin, does that really matter, or can it let's just build?
No, it really does matter, and it matters for a couple of reasons. One is I don't want it to matter in a way that is really bad when it comes to displacement and gentrification. We don't have enough tools at the local level in the state of Texas to really address displacement and gentrification. So what that means is where you're building matters maybe even more. And so back to one of the comments about preservation. How do you preserve? And how do you make sure that you can do that in a way that keeps the affordability, and at the same time doesn't add to displacement. In addition to that, the money we talk about, from the federal government, from the state government, that can then be utilized so that you can do deeply affordable, will allow for us to do things in neighborhoods that will allow for people to stay and allow families to stay. It also matters, I think, in terms of maybe the other side of the coin, where you have not had the development, the more broad-based development, because it's been so dedicated to just single family, so that you haven't been able to diversify certain neighborhoods in a way that would make good sense. I think the 3 by right that we're talking about, I think even the minimum lot size will change a lot of that, particularly when you make it easier to do ADUs and things of that nature and allow people to age in place. So yeah, it matters. The other thing I would like to say about that is it matters in the sense that, particularly when you have I'd say 2 things. One is it matters when you're trying to provide public service. It's easier and cheaper to provide things like public safety in a denser environment. So having that density actually benefits the community in that regard. It also, the so-called now 15-minute city and that kind of thing, but being able to have things near where you want to live makes it, I think, a higher quality of life. So, and when the state legislature does things like starts taking away your extraterritorial jurisdiction, your inability to annex, it's going to make a difference with regard to also your tax base. So yeah, it matters.
Yeah, I also think about convenience. Being as a homeowner, that was actually very important to me when I would purchase my homes. Mary, talk to us about demand. How does that impact?
Yeah, it doesn't, I think that it does obviously matter where we build housing, but it also matters on the demand side, who are we building housing for and what do they want? And so, one of the biggest groups right now of home purchasers are millennials. They want, first-time homes, they want condos, they want townhouses, they want a place where they can walk in their community. They prefer walkability and transit. So building all of those options are really important. The other big group that I think about are baby boomers who all want to stay in their houses. And in part, that's part of our supply problem because those houses are not turning over. And part of that is that they can't live in their community because they don't have scale down options. So even if they are looking to downsize, they can't buy a condo in a senior community or, find a smaller single family home that is one level. And so creating those options are really important if we want to actually loosen up the market as well.
Thank you. And Danielle, can you speak to us from a perspective of the geographics around where?
Yeah, and I'll also add on, we hosted a panel on Saturday with some builders thinking about future-proof housing and what do consumers want, and it's thinking about the total cost of ownership and how you can provide that sort of thing, and thinking about affordability from that perspective. Regionally, in that report that I mentioned at the very beginning of this panel, we looked across the U.S. and we saw that the South is really leading the way. Even though the gap is largest in the South, when we look at the number of houses that we need to build, the population is very large here as well. And so if we look at how long we think it'll take to close that gap, the South is on pace to close the gap in only 3 years. And that's because building recently has been extraordinarily strong in the South. So it's got a sizable gap, but making some really good headway, probably because you're not the only locality in the South that's making some good progress here. And if we look at, across the nation, it's 6.5 years in the West, 41 years in the Midwest, and unfortunately this year was really tough for the Northeast. They did not see a lot of construction, and so it is not on track to close the gap. So it really matters what you build, who you're building it for, how affordable it is, and we see that reflected in the regional numbers.
Thank you for that. And thank you, all three of you, for your very generous time and answers for these questions. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, and it looks like we have a little bit of time to be able to address those. So the first one, I will say, this is directed at the mayor. If you have a perspective on Texas more broadly, Realtor.com's recent report on the state of Texas real estate market made the point that Texas had less than 10% of the U.S. population, but more than 15% of new home starts. Texas is on track to become the biggest state in the union, and the number one reason people arrive here is affordable housing. In contrast, most people coming to Texas come from California, which is on the opposite end of the spectrum, producing a disproportionately low share of new housing. What is Texas doing that is so effective, and what can other states like California learn from you?
Well, man, that's a loaded question. There's so much in there. There's so much in there. But what's interesting about that question is the definition of affordability, right? The definition of what jumps out at me is that it's affordable by comparison. And so a lot of people are moving here, and when they move here, and I'll use Austin as an example, they move here from California and they say it is very affordable based upon my California standards. So I'm able to take the money I made off that small bungalow I had in California and buy a bigger house in Austin. But when that happens, and it's happening over and over and over again over time, what it does is it drives up, it reduces our supply, and it drives up the price overall. And so what it does is it creates an affordability issue, a cascading affordability issue here. And as was pointed out, they may buy a smaller house, by smaller relative in Austin, but that takes away from the supply of somebody else that might have wanted to come into that. So it is an ongoing problem where we have to address it in terms of providing more supply. Now, why is that happening? It's happening for a variety of reasons, including, right now, the people that want to be in Austin, Texas, a big part of the reason they want to be in Austin, Texas is the quality of life, and we're so open to the startups and them starting their own businesses and things of that nature. I think it ultimately comes down to quality of life issues, but a relative affordability, relatively more affordable, and that causes people to show up. But it means we have to be, to use a Texas phrase, on our horse all the time, because we got to get the supply up.
I was thinking, I heard in that, you can't stand still. So very similar idea.
Another audience question is, old housing development models don't fully work, but new ones aren't fully formed yet. How open are you to implementing innovative solutions while zoning and coding catch up? Mary, do you be open to tackle that one?
I mean, I think that definitely is a mayor question. I'll start it, and then I think people want to hear what you have to say, Mayor Watson. I mean, I think we are at the cutting edge of a lot of different technologies. I mean, I think manufactured housing, prefabricated housing, all of that has come a really long way, and we need to think about what it does take to scale it and try it out. While keeping an eye on climate resilience, while keeping an eye on making sure that those models are safe. And I think part of that is having new financing mechanisms to really be able to test out new technologies and ways of providing housing.
As long as what we do is we do it where, as I said earlier, we do it with a performance review constantly in our head and constantly in the way we go about doing it, we know what the issue is. We know what the challenge is. Now let's be willing to be imaginative and creative. And I live in a place that, it prides itself on its creativity and imagination. So help us, let's come up with new things. but let's always evaluate it to make sure we're not messing something up. I will tell you, and Mary just mentioned it, that's like the third time she's mentioned something about financing. And I'm really glad you've done that 3 times, right? Because one of the things that I don't think we're creative enough right now on is financing. In fact, it's the same old way. And one of the things is you might build a whole lot more rental, and we need a whole lot more rental, and we need a whole lot more affordable rental. But one of the things that we really need to do is we need to have different financing mechanisms that will allow people to create generational wealth. And we don't have those. There are places in Austin where when we gave the go-ahead to them, we thought we would see greater, and we said, put more affordable housing in there. And then 20 years later, there's a really great neighborhood, but it's nowhere near as diverse as we thought it would be. And a part of that is lack of access to credit, lack of access to capital, and we don't have the tools to do those kinds of things. So we need to be imaginative and creative so that we can put people on a path. If I'm sitting here talking about generational fairness, one of the things we need are the tools to allow that generational fairness to truly be realized.
I think in addition to that, though, you need to have enough slack in the real estate market to lessen the competitive intensity. Because even though there are, maybe we could have more variety, but there are options like FHA loans and VA loans that are, I think, better utilized by underserved borrowers. When the market is intensely competitive, those buyers still tend to be at a disadvantage.
Very, very good point. And I had somebody say to me today that is in the real estate game that a resilient market will see ebbs and flows. And that's a very important thing is it's okay. It's okay for there to be an ebb, like right now to some degree. That's okay. The sky isn't always falling. It's not falling when the prices are up, and it's not falling when the prices are down. A resilient, good market will have ebbs and flows. And part the reason you want that is exactly what you just said. It opens up other opportunities that may not always be there.
Well, I know for me, I think being in the real estate industry, I think about these things a lot, especially when it comes to home ownership in particular. And, speaking of innovative mindset or opportunities, I think about assumable mortgages. It's an underutilized opportunity to get the market moving. And then the second thing that I've been thinking about for probably about a year now is like mortgage portability. Like, what if you could just port your mortgage from one house to the next? You'd see more people potentially move, which would allow, again, this unlocking of inventory. But with that being said, I love this discussion. Thank you all so much for this. This has been such a pleasure to listen to you and learn from you. And, one of my favorite sayings from college was text without context is pretext, meaning information without facts and discussion and information behind it really can be misinterpreted falsely. So I love that we had the numbers. So we had the text, but we also had the context, both at the local and federal level. So thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you all.
Thanks to Realtor.com.
Thank you, and have a wonderful day.